Her true story from Texas. At 67, they told me step aside. That was their biggest mistake. Have you ever been told you are too old to matter? Too fragile to fight? That your time for making important decisions has passed? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear how you proved them wrong. Don't forget to subscribe to her light for more inspiring stories of women who refuse to give up. You need to step aside now, Dorothy. This isn't your choice to make anymore. Thomas's voice boomed across his sprawling ranch-style kitchen, every word dripping with the kind of condescension that made my skin crawl. He stood there with his arms crossed, flanked by his new wife Sandra and their adult son Marcus, all three of them nodding, like they would rehearse this moment. The way they looked at me like I was some confused old woman who had wandered into the wrong conversation made my hands tremble, but not from weakness, from rage. I sat there in that uncomfortable wooden chair, my purse clutched tightly in my lap, watching my ex-husband of 30 years treat me like I was already dead. At 67, I would buried my husband Frank, just 2 years prior. And now I would just lost my precious daughter, Sarah, to a sudden heart attack at only 42. The doctors said it was a rare genetic condition, completely undetectable, until it was too late. One moment she was laughing on the phone with me about her daughter's upcoming school play, telling me how Grace had memorized all her lines and was so excited to play a sunflower in the spring production. The next moment she was gone, leaving behind 8-year-old Grace, who had been staying with me that terrible week while Sarah was in the hospital. I could still hear Sarah's voice from that last conversation, the way she would said, "Mom, Grace keeps asking when I am coming home. What should I tell her?" I would told her to be honest but hopeful, never imagining those would be among the last words we would ever share. The memory of that phone call haunted me every night, how I would promised Sarah that everything would be fine, how I would told her to rest and focus on getting better, how I would assured her that Grace was safe with me and not to worry about anything except her recovery. My name is Dorothy Martinez, and I have lived in Amarillo, Texas, my whole life. I raised 3 children in a small house on Buchanan Street, worked double shifts at the diner to keep food on the table, and somehow managed to keep my family together even when Thomas decided his secretary was more interesting than his wife. That was back in 1995, when I was still young enough to believe that good wives don't ask questions, and that love means accepting whatever scraps you are given. I remember the day he left like it was yesterday. He would pack his belongings into cardboard boxes while I was at work, leaving only a note on the kitchen table that said he needed to find himself. What he would really found was a 25-year-old woman named Jennifer who didn't have stretch marks or crow's feet, who didn't remind him that he would once promised to love someone for better or worse. I would come home to empty dresser drawers, and the smell of his cologne still lingering in the bathroom, along with the devastating realization that my marriage had been over long before he would found the courage to actually leave. But this wasn't about my past with Thomas. This was about Grace, my granddaughter, my Sarah's baby girl, who still had nightmares about watching her mama collapse in their kitchen. Grace, who clung to my hand during the funeral service and whispered, "Grandma Dorothy, are you going to leave me too?" My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces that day. But I made her a promise. Never. "Sweetheart, Grandma's not going anywhere. I should have known Thomas would have other plans. You live in that tiny old house." Sandra chimed in, her voice sharp and calculating. "You are on Social Security. You are almost 70. It is just not realistic." She said the word 70 like it was a disease, something shameful that disqualified me from having opinions about my own family. "I may be getting older," I said quietly, keeping my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me, "but I am not helpless." Thomas actually laughed. "Dorothy, you can barely work your smartphone. You think you can handle raising a child at your age? Look what happened with Sarah." He stopped himself, but the damage was done. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Sandra had the decency to look uncomfortable. I stared at him, not with hurt this time, but with clarity. This man had missed Sarah's high school graduation because he was too busy. He would forgotten her birthday 3 years running, He would been absent for every scraped knee, every broken heart, every milestone that mattered. And now he wanted to lecture me about parenting. "I am not here to argue," I said, standing slowly and reaching for my coat. "I am here because I love Grace, and she needs stability." "We can provide that," Thomas said, gesturing around his pristine kitchen that looked like it had never seen a child's sticky fingers. "She needs structure, discipline, a proper family environment." "She needs love," I replied. "That is something money cannot buy." Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "You want to play the saint, fine, but the court will never give custody to someone your age, especially someone living alone on a pension." That part stung because it was partially true. After Frank died, I would been living on his railroad pension and my small savings. I didn't have a fancy house or a new car, but I had something they didn't understand. Grace loved me, and I loved her with every fiber of my being. I walked to the door without another word. Thomas didn't offer to walk me out, and I wouldn't have wanted him to anyway. As I stepped into the humid Texas evening, I didn't feel defeated. I felt determined. They thought this was about money, about who could provide more material things. They thought I would quietly disappear once lawyers got involved, that I was just some grieving grandmother with shaky hands and fading memory. They were about to learn just how wrong they could be. When I got home that night, I pulled out an old composition notebook and started writing. Not just my feelings, but facts, names, dates, conversations. Everything I could remember. I wrote down every dismissive comment, every cruel assumption, every moment that showed they saw Grace as an obligation rather than a blessing. I knew what was coming, and I knew they would underestimate me every step of the way. Good. Let them think I was just a weak old woman. It would make my victory even sweeter. 3 days later, I discovered that Thomas and his family had already filed for legal custody of Grace. I hadn't even finished selecting flowers for Sarah's grave, and somehow the paperwork was already in motion. It felt calculated, too coordinated to be coincidence. But what really made my blood boil happened. The following Tuesday, I would gone to the funeral home to pick up extra copies of Sarah's death certificate, when I overheard voices coming from the director's office. The door was slightly ajar, and inside I could see Thomas, Marcus, and Sandra huddled around a desk covered with legal documents and financial papers. "The state benefits alone will be substantial," Marcus was saying, his voice cold and businesslike, like he was discussing a stock portfolio rather than a grieving child. "Both parents deceased. Minor child, we are looking at significant monthly payments, could be anywhere from $800 to $1,200 a month, depending on how we structure the application. Don't forget about the life insurance policy," Sandra added, her manicured fingers tapping against the desk. "If we are listed as guardians, we will control the disbursement." Sarah was smart about that. She had a good policy through her work. I heard it was substantial. Thomas nodded, leaning back in his chair like he was already planning how to spend money that wasn't his. "We just need to make sure everything's handled properly. Set up the right accounts. Keep the documentation clean. The court will not question anything if we make it look like we are doing this for the child's benefit. Make it look legitimate." "What about the grandmother?" Sandra asked. And my blood turned to ice. "What if she tries to interfere?" Thomas actually laughed, a sound so cold it made me shiver. "Dorothy, she is harmless, old, broke, living in that tiny house. No judge is going to give custody to someone her age when we can offer stability and resources." Not once did they mention Grace's emotional needs, her trauma, her future dreams, or how to help her heal from losing her mother. They didn't talk about therapy, about patience, about the bedtime routine that helped her sleep, or the way she still called out for Sarah in the middle of the night. They talked about her like she was a business opportunity, a source of income that they needed to secure before someone else could claim it. My hands were shaking as I backed away from that door, my heart pounding with fury and disgust. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold, thinking about how they would look me in the eye, and questioned my ability to care for Grace while they were already planning how to profit from her tragedy. The next morning, I went through Sarah's papers that I would brought home from her apartment. In her filing cabinet, I found a copy of her life insurance policy from the school district, where she worked as a teacher. My hands trembled as I read the beneficiary information. Grace Elena Martinez. Daughter. Sole recipient. The amount was $275,000, enough to pay for college. Provide security. Build a real future for my granddaughter. Then I looked at the date on Thomas's custody petition. He would filed it just 2 days after Sarah's death, before we would even held the memorial service. Before Grace had even begun to process losing her mother. I made photocopies of everything and organized it all into a 3-ring binder. This wasn't just about grief anymore. This was about protecting Grace from people who saw dollar signs where they should have seen a heartbroken little girl. For the next month, Grace stayed with Thomas and his family, while the court reviewed the custody arrangements. I was allowed supervised visits twice a week, 2 precious hours on Tuesday evenings and Saturday afternoons. At first, I treasured those moments. But the more time I spent with Grace, the more concerned I became. She would arrive wearing clothes that didn't fit properly, or looked like they hadn't been washed in days. Her beautiful dark hair, which Sarah had always kept so neat and shiny, now hung in tangled knots. She had small cuts on her hands and bruises on her shins. And when I asked what happened, she just shrugged and said, "I don't remember." One Saturday, I asked her what she would eat for lunch. "Cereal," she said, picking at the sandwich I would made her. "Just cereal? What about dinner last night?" She looked confused. "Crackers and some milk, but the milk tasted weird." I started documenting everything. I took pictures of her appearance, wrote down everything she told me, kept notes about her behavior. I could see she was losing weight, becoming more withdrawn. The bright, chatty little girl I would known was disappearing. The worst moment came during one of our supervised visits at the local park. Grace and I were sitting on a bench watching other children play when I mentioned how nice it would be if she could spend a weekend at my house sometime. She flinched and glanced nervously at the court-appointed supervisor. "I cannot do that, Grandma Dorothy," she whispered. "Why not, sweetheart?" She looked around nervously before answering. "They said, if I ask to stay with you, I will get in trouble. They said you are too old to take care of me, and that I need to stop being a baby about it." That night, I called the one lawyer I could afford, Patricia Williams, a young attorney who had helped me with Frank's estate. She listened to my concerns and agreed to help me file a formal custody petition. "Mrs. Martinez," she said gently, "I have to be honest with you. Courts typically favor younger guardians with more financial resources. You are fighting an uphill battle. I don't need it to be easy," I told her. "I just need it to be possible." Patricia smiled. "Then let's build a case." We requested financial records for Grace's accounts, including any state benefits being received on her behalf. We filed for copies of her medical and school records. Most importantly, Patricia taught me how to document everything properly, how to gather evidence that would hold up in court. I also reached out to people in the community. Mrs. Henderson, who lived across the street from Thomas, told me she would seen Grace sitting alone in the car for hours at a time. Sometimes in the Texas heat, with just the windows cracked slightly open. "I almost called Child Protective Services one day," she said. "That poor baby was just sitting there while they were inside watching television." She agreed to write a statement. And suddenly, I had 3 pillars for my case: financial abuse, neglect, and endangerment. Word spread quickly through our small community about the custody battle. The reactions were mixed but telling. My neighbor Mrs. Chen brought over casseroles and offered to babysit whenever I had legal meetings. "That little girl belongs with you," she said firmly. "Anyone with eyes can see how much you love each other." But not everyone was supportive. Some people whispered that I was too old, that I should let the younger family handle it. I overheard Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store telling someone, Poor Dorothy doesn't realize she is biting off more than she can chew. Raising a child at her age, it is not fair to either of them. Those comments stung. But they also fueled my determination. I wasn't fighting for the approval of busybodies and gossips. I was fighting for Grace, and that was all that mattered. Patricia Williams proved to be worth every penny of her modest fees. At 32, she had already handled over a dozen grandparent custody cases and understood the unique challenges we faced. The law technically favors biological parents and their designated guardians, she explained during our first strategy meeting, but when there is evidence of mismanagement or neglect, the court's primary concern becomes the child's best interests. We just need to make sure the evidence is airtight. The next time Thomas agreed to meet with me, it was at a Denny's off Interstate 40. He slouched in the booth, like he was doing me a favor, ordering coffee, and acting like this was just another inconvenience in his day. "You wanted to talk," he said, not even looking up from his phone. I slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were printouts of Grace's benefit account statements, showing withdrawals for a new motorcycle, $3,200 expensive restaurant bills, $1,890, and a vacation to Colorado $2,887, with no record of Grace being included. "I just wanted to give you a chance to explain this before a judge sees it," I said calmly. He barely glanced at the papers before pushing the folder back toward me. "You really think you are going to win this, Dorothy? Be realistic. You are an old woman living alone in a house that is falling apart. What can you possibly offer that child?" "Love," I said simply, "something you have never understood." He leaned back, his expression turning nasty. "Don't pretend this is about love. You want that insurance money just as much as we do. At least I am honest about it." "You think I am like you," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "But you always did confuse caring with controlling." I reached into my purse and placed another receipt on the table, $650 for camping equipment, paid from Grace's account. She is 8 years old and afraid of the dark since her mother died. "When exactly did she go camping?" For the first time, Thomas looked uncomfortable. "She needs to get over her fears. She needs patience and understanding," I replied. "She needs someone who sees her as a person, not a paycheck." I placed one more document on the table, a bill for a premium golf club membership costing $1,000. "And this helps an 8-year-old. How exactly?" I stood up and put on my coat. "I will see you in court, Thomas. And this time, I will not be the quiet little wife who just takes whatever you decide to give her." The courtroom felt enormous when I walked in that morning. My hair was gray and pulled back in a simple bun, and I wore my best navy dress, the one I would bought for Frank's funeral. I didn't try to look younger or more sophisticated. I came as I was, a grandmother who loved her granddaughter enough to fight for her. Thomas's lawyer was smooth and confident, presenting their case like it was a foregone conclusion. "Mrs. Martinez is 67 years old, living on a fixed income in a modest home. While we don't question her emotional attachment to the child, the question before this court is whether she can realistically provide long-term, stable care." He painted me as a relic, someone whose time had passed. Meanwhile, he presented Thomas and his family as the obvious choice: younger, financially stable, able to provide structure and opportunity. When it was our turn, Patricia stood up with confidence, her young face set with determination. "Your Honor, what we are about to present isn't just about financial capability. It is about character. It is about who has actually been putting Grace's needs first. It is about the difference between providing for a child and profiting from a child." She called me to testify, and I opened the binder we would prepared so carefully. My hands were steady now, strengthened by weeks of preparation and righteous anger. I showed the court photographs of Grace, looking thin and unkempt, pictures that broke my heart to take, but were necessary evidence of the neglect she was enduring. "This is Grace on the 15th of March, I said, holding up a photograph. "Note her appearance: unwashed hair, clothes that don't fit, visible weight loss." This is not the same child who was thriving in my care just weeks earlier. I played a recording of our phone conversation where Grace whispered, "Grandma, I don't want to live here anymore. They yell at me when I cry for Mama. They told me crying is for babies, and that Mama isn't coming back anyway, so I should just stop." The courtroom was completely silent, as Grace's tiny voice filled the space, conveying more truth than any lawyer's argument ever could. I saw several people in the gallery wipe their eyes, and even the usually stoic judge appeared moved. I presented the financial records, showing how Grace's benefits had been used for adult entertainment, luxury items, and personal expenses that had nothing to do with a child's needs. "This is a receipt for a premium cable package, including adult movie channels," I said, placing the evidence carefully on the table. "This is a bill for a golf club membership. This is a receipt for a weekend at a casino in Oklahoma. All paid for with money intended to support an 8-year-old girl who was eating cereal for dinner." The final piece was a receipt for $6,000, $83 worth of home renovations to Thomas's master bathroom, paid entirely from Grace's trust account. This bathroom renovation included a jetted tub, imported marble countertops, and heated floors. I continued. Meanwhile, Grace was sleeping on a bare mattress in an unheated room. "Mr. Thomas," the judge said, his voice sharp with disapproval, "would you care to explain how bathroom renovations benefit an 8-year-old child?" Thomas opened his mouth, then closed it. His lawyer whispered something urgent in his ear, but no explanation came. The silence stretched on until even the court reporter stopped typing. I didn't smile or gloat. I just looked at Grace, sitting quietly with her court-appointed advocate, wearing a little yellow dress I would bought her during one of our visits. Her eyes met mine across the courtroom, wide and hopeful, and that was all the victory I needed. When the judge returned with his decision, the courtroom was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Having reviewed all evidence and testimony, he began. "The court finds that the current guardianship arrangement is not in the best interests of the minor child." My breath caught in my throat. "Effective immediately. Custody of Grace Elena Martinez is hereby granted to Dorothy Martinez for a probationary period of 6 months. He turned his stern gaze toward Thomas. "Furthermore, the court orders the immediate return of all misappropriated funds from the minor's benefit accounts, totaling $15,627. 83. Thomas shot to his feet. "This is ridiculous. She is too old, Mr. Thomas," the judge interrupted. "Based on the evidence presented, your household has demonstrated a concerning pattern of financial exploitation and neglect. You may appeal this decision, but I strongly advise you to focus on making amends for your behavior rather than challenging this court's judgment." As people began filing out of the courtroom, Thomas muttered something under his breath about how I would gotten lucky. I didn't respond. I had nothing left to prove to him. But then the moment that mattered most happened. Grace ran to me in the hallway, throwing her arms around my waist with tears streaming down her face. "Grandma Dorothy, are you really going to take care of me forever?" I knelt down to her level, smoothing her hair and wiping her cheeks. "Forever and always, sweetheart. You are never going to have to worry about that again." Sometimes the biggest victories aren't announced with fanfare. Sometimes they are whispered by 8-year-old girls who finally feel safe enough to believe in tomorrow. But the real work was just beginning. The court had given Thomas 30 days to return the misappropriated funds and transfer all of Grace's belongings to my custody. Those 30 days felt like the longest month of my life. Thomas fought the judgment every step of the way. His lawyer filed motion after motion, claiming the financial evidence was circumstantial, that the court had overreached, that I was unfit despite the ruling. Each legal challenge felt like a personal attack, but Patricia Williams stood firm. "He is posturing," she told me, during one of our weekly check-ins. "The evidence is overwhelming. He knows he is lost, but his pride will not let him accept it gracefully." The money came back in pieces, a check here, a wire transfer there, always accompanied by Thomas's lawyer's letters, claiming hardship and requesting payment plans. By the end of those 30 days, Every penny of Grace's $15,627.83 had been restored to her account, plus court-ordered interest and legal fees that Thomas had to pay out of his own pocket. Have you ever felt dismissed because of your age or circumstances? I would love to hear your story in the comments below. The day I went to pick up Grace's belongings from Thomas's house was tense and awkward. Sandra answered the door with barely concealed hostility, pointing me toward a pile of boxes on the front porch. Grace's entire life had been reduced to 4 cardboard containers: her clothes, toys, school papers, and a few photographs of Sarah that they would generously decided to include. Grace stood in the doorway, clutching a small stuffed elephant that Sarah had given her for her 6th birthday. Her eyes were wide and uncertain, darting between me and the family that had controlled her life for the past 3 months. "Am I really going home with you, Grandma Dorothy?" she whispered. I knelt down to her level, ignoring Sandra's impatient sighs behind us. "Yes, sweetheart. We are going home, our home." The relief that washed over Grace's face was worth every moment of the legal battle, every dollar spent on lawyers, every sleepless night I would endured, wondering if I was strong enough to see this through. We moved to a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood outside Dallas, far from Thomas and his family. It wasn't fancy, just 2 bedrooms above a flower shop, but it was ours. I painted Grace's room lavender and bought her a bookshelf for all the stories we would read together. For the first time in months, her laughter filled the space instead of her silence. I enrolled her in a new school where the teachers knew about her loss and were patient with her healing process. I took her to a grief counselor who specialized in helping children process trauma. Most importantly, I listened. When she wanted to talk about her mama, we talked. When she wanted to be quiet, we sat together in comfortable silence. Dr. Maria Santos, Grace's therapist, became an invaluable part of our healing journey. During our first appointment, she explained that Grace was experiencing what she called complicated grief, the normal mourning process intensified by the trauma of witnessing her mother's collapse and then being separated from her primary attachment figure, me, during the most vulnerable period of her life. Children Grace's age don't have the emotional vocabulary to express trauma, Dr. Santos explained to me after Grace's 3rd session. She is going to act it out instead. You might see regression, bedwetting, nightmares, clinginess. You might see anger that seems disproportionate to small frustrations. This is all normal and temporary. She was right. For the first 2 months, Grace barely left my side. She would follow me from room to room, panic if I had to run errands alone, and wake up screaming from nightmares about people taking her away. But slowly, with patience and consistency, she began to trust that I wasn't going anywhere. The breakthrough came 4 months after she moved in with me. Grace had been working with Dr. Santos on creating a memory book about Sarah, a collection of photos, stories, and drawings that celebrated her mother's life, rather than focusing on her death. One evening, Grace was coloring a picture of her and Sarah at the zoo when she looked up at me with clear, calm eyes. "Grandma Dorothy," she said, "I think Mama sent me to you because she knew you would keep me safe." I felt tears spring to my eyes, but I kept my voice steady. "What makes you think that?" "Sweetheart, because you fight for me," she said simply, returning to her coloring, "even when it is scary." Every evening, I cooked real meals, not fancy, but made with love. Grace would sit at the kitchen counter doing her homework, while I stirred soup or baked cornbread. Sometimes, I would catch her humming Sarah's favorite song, and my heart would ache with gratitude that she was beginning to remember her mother with joy, instead of just sadness. At bedtime, Grace would choose a book and curl up beside me on the couch. Her finger would trace the words she was learning to read, her voice growing stronger with each page. After I tucked her in, I would sit at my small desk and write in my journal. Today I wrote, "Thomas told me I was too old to make decisions, too irrelevant to matter, too weak to fight, but he was wrong about everything. Every document I filed, every truth I uncovered, every stand I took, none of it was for me. It was for her, The one person who never looked at me like I was less than enough. She chose me first, with her trust and her hope. And in fighting for her, I found parts of myself I thought I would lost forever. They underestimated me because of my age, dismissed me because of my circumstances, tried to erase me because they thought I was powerless. But now they will never forget my name, not because I was loud or dramatic, but because I refused to disappear when it mattered most. I wasn't just an old woman, I was a grandmother, a protector, a warrior, and I chose to spend the rest of my life not in silence, but in truth. Years passed in a blur of school plays, birthday parties, skinned knees, and bedtime stories. Grace grew from a traumatized 8-year-old into a confident teenager who played violin in the school orchestra and volunteered at the local animal shelter. She never forgot what we would been through together, but she didn't let it define her either. When she graduated high school with honors, I cried tears of pride and joy. When she got accepted to the University of Texas with a partial scholarship, I helped her pack her dorm room and told her stories about her mother's college days. When she called me every Sunday night from Austin just to say she was thinking of me, I knew that all those years of fighting had been worth it. But the moment that truly showed me how far we would both come happened on a spring morning when Grace was 23. She had just finished her degree in elementary education and was about to start her first teaching job when she called me with news that made my heart race. "Grandma Dorothy," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement, "I am engaged." I sat down hard in my kitchen chair, overwhelmed with happiness. "Tell me everything." She would met David in her education program, a kind, patient man who wanted to teach special needs children. They would been dating for 2 years, and he would propose during a weekend camping trip to Big Bend National Park. "There is something else," Grace said, her voice becoming softer. "I know this might sound silly, but would you walk me down the aisle? I mean, you are the one who raised me. You are the one who fought for me. You are the one who taught me what real love looks like." I was crying before I could answer. "Grace, honey, nothing would make me prouder." And so, on a beautiful October day in 2019, I stood in the vestibule of the First Methodist Church, wearing my best dress and a corsage made of white roses. Grace looked radiant in her grandmother Sarah's wedding dress, which I would kept safe all these years. The church was filled with friends, teachers, and the kind of chosen family we would build together. As the music started and the doors opened, Grace took my arm and whispered, "Thank you for never giving up on me. Thank you for giving me a reason to keep fighting," I whispered back. We walked down that aisle together, step by careful step, toward a future neither of us could have imagined when she was a scared 8-year-old and I was a grieving grandmother. The congregation rose as we passed, but all I could see was David waiting at the altar with tears in his eyes and love in his heart. When the officiant asked, "Who gives this woman to be married?" I said clearly, "She gives herself with the love and blessing of her family." It was the truth. Grace had grown into a woman who knew her own mind, made her own choices, and loved with her whole heart. During the reception, I watched her dance with David, surrounded by friends who loved her and colleagues who respected her. She would become everything Sarah had dreamed she could be, and more. Later, as the evening wound down, Grace found me sitting at a table covered in fairy lights, watching the stars appear in the Texas sky. She pulled up a chair beside me, just like she used to when she was small and needed comfort. "Grandma, can I ask you something I have never asked before?" I nodded, taking her hand. "Were you scared when you were fighting for me? Were you afraid you might lose?" I squeezed her fingers, still soft and warm from dancing, terrified. "Every single day, but I was never alone, sweetheart. Even when you were too young to speak up for yourself, I felt your love giving me strength. Every time I wanted to give up, I remembered the way you held my hand and whispered, 'Please don't leave me, Grandma.' That is all I needed to keep going." She laid her head on my shoulder. "I am never going anywhere. You know, David understands you are part of our package deal." I laughed through my tears. "Good, because I am not done being your grandmother yet." We sat there for a long time, listening to the distant music and feeling the cool October breeze. As she stood to rejoin the celebration, I remained under the stars, my hand resting where her head had been, and whispered a prayer of gratitude to Sarah, wherever she was. People see a story like ours and think the strength came from the courtroom victory or the wedding day triumph. They look at the happy ending and assume that is where the power was born, but they are wrong. Real strength comes from the middle, from the weeks and months and years of small choices that nobody sees. Mine came not from being fearless, but from being afraid over and over again, and choosing to stand up anyway. I wasn't always brave. For most of my life, I stayed quiet. I accepted less than I deserved, and called it compromise. I swallowed hurt like medicine, and pretended it was good for me. I cried behind closed doors and smiled in public, even when my heart was breaking. When Thomas left me, it wasn't shocking, it was just the final confirmation of what I would known for years. But what did shock me was how quickly people forgot that I would helped build that life too. How they only saw me as someone who had been left behind, instead of someone who had held everything together while it fell apart. Then came Sarah, my light, my girl with her father's stubborn streak and my gentle heart. She was everything I would hope to become before life taught me to settle for less. When she died, part of me died too. But Grace kept me breathing, kept me moving, kept me believing that love was still worth fighting for. When they tried to take her from me, when they looked at my age and decided it meant irrelevance, when they mistook my grief for weakness, that is when I discovered something important. When you have been underestimated long enough, it stops being an insult and becomes camouflage. They thought I was just a sad old woman with shaky hands and faded memories, but I was steel wrapped in silence. I kept receipts, learned legal procedures, taught myself to navigate systems designed to dismiss people like me. I turned every wrinkle into wisdom and every gray hair into determination. That is the funny thing about getting older in a world that worships youth. People think you are disappearing, when really you are just becoming harder to erase. After I won custody of Grace, I didn't celebrate with champagne or victory dances. I just exhaled for what felt like the first time in months and began building a life worth living. Not a perfect life, not a wealthy life, just a real one filled with love and laughter and the kind of security that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. Grace would ask me things during those quiet years. What was Mama's favorite color? How did you know you loved Grandpa Frank? What is the bravest thing you ever did? And I would answer honestly, because children remember what you say when you think they are not listening. One day, when she was about 12, she looked up from her homework and said, "Grandma Dorothy, I am going to remember you forever." "Well," I said, folding the laundry that never seemed to end, "I will try to give you good things to remember." Now, years later, I sit on my front porch in the evenings with a cup of tea and a view of the sunset. I listen to the sound of children playing in the street and think about all the women like me who are sitting at family gatherings, hearing their worth reduced to their age or their income or their marital status. I want to tell them, you are not too old to matter. You are not too tired to fight. You are not finished writing your story. There is still fire in your heart and wisdom in your experience. You are still the author of what happens next. So when they say you are too old to make demands, you tell them you are not making demands, you are making choices. When they say you don't get to decide anymore, you show them that you have been deciding all along, quietly and carefully, and with more wisdom than they will ever understand. I used to be the woman who apologized for taking up space. Now I am the one holding the pen. And the story I am writing begins with a grandmother who remembered her worth and ends with a granddaughter who never had to question hers. The truth is, age doesn't make you irrelevant. It makes you dangerous. Because you have got nothing left to lose except the people you love. And there is no force on earth more powerful than a woman protecting what matters most to her heart. Years later, when people ask me what I would tell other grandmothers facing similar battles, I always say the same thing. Age is not your enemy. It is your secret weapon. You have survived decades of challenges, raised families, weathered storms that would break younger people. That experience isn't weakness, it is armor. And sometimes, the world needs to be reminded that the fiercest protectors often come in the most unexpected packages. Today, at 75, I sit on my front porch, watching Grace's 3-year-old daughter, Emma, play in the same garden where Grace once helped me plant tomatoes. Yes, I became a great-grandmother. And yes, Thomas missed that milestone too. Some things never change. Grace and David live just 2 streets over. Close enough for daily visits, but far enough for their independence. Emma calls me Gigi and has Grace's dark eyes and Sarah's stubborn streak. When she throws her tiny tantrums, I see echoes of all the strong women who came before her. Grace has become an exceptional teacher, just like her mother, and she volunteers with children in foster care. "I want to be the adult who fights for kids the way you fought for me," she told me once. Thomas and I rarely speak these days, though we exchange polite nods at Grace's major life events. I harbor no bitterness. I got what I was fighting for, and he lost far more than money. He lost the chance to know the remarkable woman Grace became, and that is a consequence he will live with forever. As for Sandra and Marcus, they faded from our lives completely after the trial. Sometimes Grace mentions seeing them around town, but they have never attempted to build any relationship with her. Their loss, truly. If Dorothy's courage inspired you to never give up on what matters most, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for her light. Share this story with any woman who needs to remember her own strength. Sometimes that is all another grandmother needs to hear to find the courage to fight her own battles. What is your story of fighting against the odds? Share it in the comments below. Your courage might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today. Because when we share our stories, we don't just tell what happened, we tell what is possible. And sometimes, that is the most powerful gift we can give each other.